Okay, so without further introductions, we'll start our first panel, which deal with communities in private law, and specifically, I think this panel deals with communities in property law. So I will introduce the speakers, and please just sit here. Anyone who sit here or stand here or whatever, just because we are taping it. So the first speaker in this panel is a great friend and a great scholar. And we had, an evening for the publication of his new book, Human Flourishing and Property, or Property and Human Flourishing. Just last Thursday, Shelley and I organized it. And I welcome Professor Gregory Alexander from Cornell University to speak about community and communities in the human flourishing theory of property. So, Greg.
Morning, everyone. First, many thanks to Shai for his enormous work in putting this conference together. You've done a really superb job, and I'm very grateful. Community is, of course, a notoriously slippery concept. Both as a social institution and as a value, community has many diverse forms. Yet its diversity does not render it meaningless or useless. For the fact is that we, all of us, live our lives as members of communities, usually several of them simultaneously. In the human flourishing theory of property, communities are the mediating vehicles through which we have come to acquire the capabilities that are necessary for us to live well-lived lives. Capabilities that include health, education, personal security, the ability to engage in practical reasoning, and so on. Even as free and autonomous persons, we never cease to operate within and depend upon the matrices of the many communities in which we find ourselves in association. Each of our identities is inextricably connected in some sense to others with whom we are connected as members of multiple communities. Further, according to the human flourishing theory, precisely because these communities are essential to our access to well-lived lives, we owe to ourselves the obligation to belong to and support the various communities that nurture the development of our necessary capabilities for flourishing. These arguments suggest that community and communities play a key role in the human flourishing theory of property. Community defines the parameters of the obligations that property owners owe. Yet, community is not inherently benign. There is a dark side to community, and that's what I want to talk about. As a political ideal, community historically has had two basic strands, both of which have been problematic, sometimes intensely so. One is the corporatist side, which is a hierarchical form of community that historically has lent itself to notorious episodes of domination and oppression, National Socialism being only the most obvious example. The other is an anarchist strand of community, utopian in inspiration, dominating, and even genocidal in practice. Communism is the obvious example here. As a social institution, communities exclude, depending on how we conceive of them. Under a conception of community as those social groups whose members are bound together by shared values, communities, by their nature, exclude. Precisely because they are constituted by shared commitments to specific goods, they must, in symbolic effect, if not in conscious intention, exclude some members of society, precluding those individuals from participating in the group's internal life. Therein lies the dilemma for communities. For by excluding others, communitarian groups radically limit their capacity to develop sympathy for others, thereby contradicting a universal communitarian ideal itself. A related problem concerns a community's internal relations. So up to this point, I've just talked about the inside-outside problem. Now, the inside-inside problem. Restrictions are important for maintaining, symbolically and instrumentally, the community's identity, not only in its public face, but also within. Restrictions on specific forms of behavior, what religious or sexual practices are acceptable, what range of books may be read, and even more seemingly innocuous behavioral restrictions, like restrictions on the consumption of tobacco or alcohol, create the community's boundary in its own internal consciousness. Although members may give restrictions different meanings, the community cannot permit its members freely to opt out of all restrictions while remaining members of the community. What Roberto Unger calls the paradox of group cohesion exists because the community as ideal's commitment to protect rather than subordinate the individual self. As Unger observes, by its very nature, community is always on the verge of becoming oppression. Jeremy Waldron has been particularly forceful in articulating concerns about community's potential for oppression. Waldron states, true community, in the sense of actually existing community, a real community structured by a communitarian, is not always as nice as it looks. Waldron continues, actually existing communities are often exclusionary and inauthentic. Moreover, he says, in the real world, the word community is found more commonly in the company of terms like gated. Waldron's anxiety is that community as an ideal is perverted when it is converted into a social institution. He focuses specifically on homeless persons, persons who lack any private property from which they are not subject to eviction. The homeless lack community as well as property. Waldron notes, and some commentators have suggested, that the solution for homelessness is a greater sense of community. Waldron thinks this answer to the problem of homelessness is wrong-headed. He says, too often the problem for those who are poor and marginalized is not that there has been an insufficient assertion of claims of community in the face of, say, market individualism. The problem, rather, is one of exclusion or expulsion from community. Waldron's diagnosis is, I think, wrong. The problem for the homeless is not with community. Although, as I've already indicated, I agree with his view that community inherently has a dark side. The problem is with property. Specifically, it is with the view that ownership inherently and invariably carries with it a strong, nearly absolute right to exclude the rest of the world, a view that Waldron apparently endorses. To paraphrase the quote from Waldron, the problem is rather one of assuming that the owner always has, or nearly always has, the right to exclude. Once we realize that the right to exclude is far more limited than Waldron supposes, and moreover, that owners owe members of their manifold communities obligations to support development of the capabilities that are necessary for their flourishing, then we see that property owners, at least in some situations, are morally obligated and should be legally obligated to be part of the solution to homelessness. Elsewhere, Waldron recognizes an attractive side to community and communitarianism. This is the side, he states, that, quoting him, encourages us to look at the conditions of viability of actual communities. And it predicts that those communities will sometimes surprise us, which means that actually existing communities have the potential to teach us something about social and political ideals. Waldron states that there is a certain sociological givenness about community. In this sense of the term, it contrasts, he finds, with utopian ideals on the one hand and with club, cult, and commune on the other. In this community as actually lived sense, people simply find themselves within communities, not by choice, but by understanding who it is that one is unavoidably side by side with, and who it is that the impact of one's actions and decisions are going to be felt by, whether one chooses this or not. In this sense, the sharing that matters is not the values, but the very fact that all the members are together in the same space, the same predicament. Hence, the fellow members of one's community are not necessarily people like oneself, they are rather those with whom one cannot avoid acting. This is indeed an attractive sense of community. It is attractive both normatively and positively. Its positive attraction derives from the fact that it accurately captures how we in fact live our lives. So, I'm a part of the community that is Cornell Law School, and within that, the smaller communities are the classes I teach. I've not chosen the members of these communities, at least not all of them. Rather, I find myself simply with them every day. I must learn how to get along with them, and they with me, in all my many oddities and foibles. This is how we live our lives. Yet, this sense of community is also normatively attractive because it is not exclusionary. As Waldron states, community in this sense, provides a basis on which human concerns are felt, values pursued, commitments entered into, among relatively large numbers of people who accept that since they're living more or less permanently in each other's company, they have a responsibility to orient their actions and relations to the shared environment, moral as well as physical, in which all of them must live. Waldron's account of community as actually lived closely resembles a moral value that captures much of what I take to be the meaning of community as a moral value itself: sociability. By sociability, I mean the ability to identify with others and to see them as concrete human beings, like oneself, rather than as the other. It further means regarding oneself as connected with others in myriad ways, including the sharing of the quotidian details of ordinary life. In some cases, the connections are thicker, such as the sharing of values. But as a normative matter, what community strives for is the gradual development within each person of attitudes of sympathy, understanding, concern, openness, patience, and care. Community as a good includes an other-regarding perspective. This is not to say that such an outlook is a reality. Community, in this sense, is a moral value, not an account of human behavior. Reality sometimes, perhaps often, falls far short of what we consider to be the good. Such is more than likely the case with regard to the way in which most of us view other people, especially those who we do not know well, or at all, some, if not much of the time. Nevertheless, the good remains what it is. We cannot evade or sidestep the issue simply by pointing to Jeremy Waldron's comments about the attractive aspects of community as actually lived. For Waldron himself goes on to note that what are sometimes called community norms, in fact, resemble, quoting him here, the imposition of a particular a priori vision of a few persons, often outsiders, on a community that has traditionally organized itself on quite another basis. Waldron is certainly right to be concerned about this dark side of community. I'm talking about a different side of community, however, a side that we all need. We all need to feel that we belong somewhere, to be comfortable with a group of people with whom we share some experience that is deeply important in our lives. I have friends who have problems with overeating. Suppose that I'm one of them. Suppose that I have issues with self-image that lead me to eat excessively, then purge. Someone says something to me that devastates my sense of self-worth. I eat a quart of ice cream to relieve this pain, but finding that it doesn't help, indeed contributes to the problem, I purge. So I join a 12-step support group, Overeaters Anonymous, and experience a sense of belonging. These are the only folks who really understand how I feel and what I experience, and for the first time, I feel comfortable with them. Overeaters Anonymous does have requirements for membership. Closed meetings are open only to persons who, quote, have a desire to stop overeating. This requirement does act as a form of exclusion, but it is not at all like the exclusion practiced by those who form closed armed encampments in remote places like Montana or Idaho. It is a benign form of exclusion, not contributing to further subordination of traditionally oppressed groups. This is not community's dark side, but instead the type of community that humans need to experience a fruitful life. Community is both a social fact and a norm. In both respects, there's reason to be mindful of community's capacity to contribute to forms of exclusion that are simply unacceptable. But our cautiousness about this dark side of community should not lead us to overlook or undervalue what it contributes to our lives and how it enables humans to flourish. Thank you.